Hello and welcome to a video on how to create your own landscape materials in Unreal Engine 4.26. Well, I'm using 4.26, but this video should apply to other versions as well. Through this video, I will walk through 3 different ways to set up a landscape material so that you can use the landscape mode paint tool to paint on different areas, different textures onto your landscape in different ways. So in this case, I have some snow, I have some grass, and I have some concrete as well. Each version will have its own benefits and drawbacks, which I will talk about along the way. The first material is a pretty straightforward one. Allows us to take 3 separate textures and paint them on as a color into the material of your landscape. Then we will build on that in this slightly bigger node tree by adding the possibility for other texture types. So if you have a normal map or if you have a roughness map, how you can bring those into your material as well. I'll also talk about a little bit of parameterization, so exposing different aspects of this material to the instanced material editor so that you can change things around on the fly without having to recompile your material. And for the last material, I will introduce material functions to help us clean up our node tree a little bit, as well as look into fixing the dreaded tiling issue where your terrain becomes a obviously repeated pattern because we are, after all, using images repeated over and over and over. This is just an introduction to landscape materials. There are a lot more complex things that you can do, but hopefully this video will give you the tools that you need to start painting different textures onto your landscapes. Before I begin, I will make note that I am using, where did my taskbar go? Quixel Megascans. So I'm using a program called Quixel Bridge, which if you haven't used before, I will link to a different video walking through how and why to use that. Essentially, it gives you access to Megascans, which is a collection of over 14,000 different realistic photo-scanned assets which are free to use in Unreal Engine. Yeah, if you haven't looked into that, I strongly encourage it, but I won't go through the details of how to use that in this video. However, the one thing that I will change is if I click any of my assets that I've already downloaded and got locally, and go to the little gear icon. This is a new interface for Quixel, so you might have a different interface if you have one of the older versions, but somehow go to your export settings. And then under file names, you have the option of changing the name of the file that is exported to your Unreal version. If we look at this, we've got the map name, so whether it's a normal, albedo, displacement, etc. The resolution, in our case, in my case, I'm using 4K. LODs, so any different resolutions for different levels of detail, and then finally the ID. And if I pop back over into Unreal and have a look in, I already have a couple of surfaces in my project already. So I've got in a folder called Fresh Windswept Snow. Each texture comes in with what that texture is, so displacement in this case, the resolution, and then a string of random letters, and that's the ID. So the texture itself doesn't have the name of the material. The material does, but the texture doesn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add to this by saying $$name. And that means that if we look at this example, what the texture itself comes in with mossy forest floor, 2 by 2 meters. This isn't strictly necessary, but it will help when I search for textures by name. And it looks like you do need the resolution and the LOD. If you try to get rid of those, it will tell you that LOD is required. So I'm going to keep everything in there. Just include the name as well. All right, so once I save that, I'm going to add the mossy floor, the dirty snow, and let's add some cliff rock just to see what happens. We might not end up using that. Now we wait for Unreal to bring it all in. This can take a while, especially if you're doing a lot of surfaces. And we're done. Fantastic. So let's just double check that all of my assets that I just exported came in okay. So we've got the cliff rock, the mossy floor, uncut grass, which I had from earlier, fresh windswept snow, and then dirty snow. In fact, I'm going to do one more snow. There's fresh snow. Let's export that as well. And I'll talk about why I made that choice later, when we get to it. Or maybe I'll forget. The first thing to note is that the materials, or the assets come in from Quixel with a material already. And that material is an instance of, if we go into MS presets, the default material has the default material here. So all of the materials that you bring in from Quixel Megascans or from Quixel Bridge will create a material instance based on this material. But that's not what we want, because the landscape, we need to set up a material in a different way to use layers, which is not what this default material has. All I'm interested in is the texture maps that came in, and I'll be using those in a little bit. I'm going to start from scratch by creating a new map called, well, I guess I already have that one, which I'll just delete. Create a new map called Landscape Material Map. Let's go over and see what that looks like. And here we are. In characteristic Unreal fashion, the map contains absolutely nothing, so we need to give it some stuff. The first thing that I'm going to do is give it a sky sphere, the blueprint sky sphere, drag it in, and under the transform in the details panel of the sky sphere, just hit that little reset to default so that the sky sphere is in the direct center of the map. Let's also add in a directional light. Drag in that directional light and hit reset on that, but not on the rotation. I just pressed F to center the light because for the rotation, I'm going to set my own rotation of the sun once I have my landscape. For now, just a little bit of a maybe 45-degree angle, 40-ish degree angle. If I'm doing anything that is confusing, by pressing W, E, R, these are just the hotkeys for how to change between move, rotate, and scale. And if you look in the bottom left-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, you can see the keys that I'm pressing for that. The next thing that I want to do is connect my directional light to the sky sphere so that the sun spot appears in the place that I would anticipate it would be based on the direction of the light. So the way to do that is by going into directional light, selecting the sky sphere, going into directional light, actor, and choosing the directional light that I have in the scene. When I do that, the sky sphere will update itself, but if I then change the light any more, so give it, coming from the horizon, a little bit of a sunset, I will need to go back into my sky sphere and hit refresh material for that to update. So just keep that in mind. If you're moving the light around and saying, why isn't my sky updating? You do need to refresh that material. So just for the sake of editing the landscape, I'm going to bring the directional light coming in. It's going to be high noon-ish. So refresh that material, and now we have a sort of midday sun, which is good enough for me. This is not a lighting video, this is a landscape video, so let's forget about the lighting now and move on to the landscape. To add a new landscape, we'll go into modes and then hit landscape, and the first tab that comes up, we have 3 tabs in the viewport window right now, and the first is manage, and because we don't have a landscape to manage yet, we are prompted to create a landscape. This can become a bit of an arduous process. If you are trying to figure out a really, really big world or a really small world, you will have to do a little bit of tweaking these values. I will also link to a Unreal documentation on how best to do that. There's a balance between performance and quality, as there is with basically everything. For now, I'll leave things at the default, except for one setting. I'm going to change the location to 0 on the Z-axis, just so that the landscape comes in at world 0. But for everything else, I'll leave the scale at 100, the section size at 63, so each of these tiny little squares inside the larger squares is going to be, there's 63 of those smaller squares, and the number of components 8 by 8, which you could increase if you wanted a larger world. So if we wanted something, 12 by 12, or decrease if you wanted a smaller world. But for now, I'll keep it at 8 by 8, and that ultimately ties into the overall resolution. So if you increase the number of components, that resolution goes up, and if you decrease the resolution, the number of components goes down. There is some maths that you can do to figure out what the optimal landscape size for your scene is, but you can do that on your own. I will link to the article on how to set that up. So this is the default at the moment, and I'm going to hit create. Right, the first thing, big red lighting needs to be rebuilt, and that's because I forgot to, in my select mode, under directional light, change this from stationary to movable, because I wanted to be able to move my main light over the course of the day. And now I don't have to rebuild my lighting. Back in landscape, our landscape has been created with the default. If we click on a landscape and look at what the material is, there is no material. So it uses this default checkered no material exists pattern. Okay, very briefly, in the sculpt tool, I'm going to quickly sculpt a little bit of a landscape so that we have some interesting geometry to play around with. So let's create a little bit of a mountain in the background over there. That's very sensitive. It's very much on the fly. And we'll take the noise, reduce that strength to 0.05, reduce the scale down a little bit. Even that's quite intense. Then I will change this to add only so that I can add some noise over here. And lastly, I'll hit flatten and with a bit of a higher strength, flatten us out a little cove over here. And then maybe go back and add in some very small noise on the ground. Anyway, good enough for government work. Next thing I'll do, I should have done this before, this is what I usually do at the beginning. I have the third person starter kit, which you could add. If you don't have, you can go add feature or content pack, and under blueprint feature, choose, where is it, third person. And this will just allow us to bring in the mannequin character mesh into our scene. And if I go back into object mode to have a look at this guy in the scene, I'm going to drag around a little bit for some scale. Yeah, there we go. There's some mountains in the background. They're probably a little too steep for what I want to do today, so I might smooth those out a little bit. Ooh, way too smooth. You know what? It's fine. We're not going to worry about being perfect right now, by any means. Cool. That'll do. Okay, so next, let's actually get to what we want to do today, which is create a landscape material. I have a folder called materials, which I encourage you to create if you don't already. And I have the four materials that I created earlier, one of which is an instance. Just to clean things up a little bit, I'll create an archive folder and move those guys into that so that they're not interfering with the content of this video. And I also have a couple of materials functions, which I'm going to move into archive as well. So we have a very clear folder. I'll delete that for now because I'll add it in when I need to. Okay, so to create the simplest material, we only need, the first thing that we need is a material, and I'm going to call this m underscore simple landscape material. The material there at the end is a little bit redundant, but if you're unfamiliar with why I call this the way that I did, the sort of naming convention is in Unreal is to add a M underscore for materials, SM for static meshes, or whatever type of asset you are creating. Prefix the asset type for, as far as I understand, because it makes it easier to search. Naming is a very important thing in Unreal because we use searching a lot. The users of Unreal use searching a lot. So I created this landscape material, but if I was to go back into my content, I could search for that by typing M underscore. All of my materials are now there, and then landscape, and I have all of the landscape materials that I created, except I called mine simple landscape. Anyway, naming is important, so keep track of your naming. Cool, let's double click into this and open up a new window. I'll keep those open for now. If you are totally new to materials, I encourage you to watch the introductory series that I will link to below to get you up to speed on some of the more foundational concepts. But for now, I'll assume that you have a beginner's understanding of some of the more foundational concepts. For example, to the most simple textured material that we could create uses a sample texture node. Nope, texture sample node. There we go. Texture sample node, which we can either choose a texture directly in this node itself or from a texture object. For now, I'll just choose it from the texture object, and I'm going to choose the grass texture that we brought in earlier, or that I brought in earlier before this video. So if you don't have a grass texture, bring one in. Even though grass isn't in the name, it is in the folder name, so this is one way that we don't necessarily need to have that naming, but for safety's sake, I prefer to have it. For example, if I type in snow now, then I have all the different snows that I brought in earlier. But I'm going to choose grass and take the RGB into base color. I glossed over, I used the albedo, which is the sort of base color translation. Right, let's apply that, and in my landscape object, so not the landscape gizmo, but the landscape object, in the details panel under landscape, there is an option to drag in a landscape material. So I have my simple landscape material, which I will just drag in to that, and after Unreal thinks for a second, there we go. We've got some landscape. The first thing that you'll notice is that it's very shiny, which is not exactly how grass works. So we'll get into adding the sort of baked-in roughness map in a little bit, but for now I'm just going to create a new constant. So I can either right-click and type constant, or I can hold down 1 on my keyboard. We'll see, I'm holding down 1 and then click. Which will add a constant of 1. And if I did that with 2, I would have a vector 2 coming in. And if I did that with 3, I would have a vector 3, which is a color, etc., etc. So a roughness of value 1 will, once I apply that, at the very least get rid of that shine to the grass. So it's not perfect, but there we go. Okay, now I have a grass material that's covering the whole landscape, which is awesome, but I still can't paint anything. So if I'm still in the landscape editor, or the landscape mode, and if I hop over into paint, there are no options here for me to paint some stuff. Clicking and dragging doesn't do anything, because I need to now add layers to my material. And adding layers is a very simple process. All I need to do is right click somewhere in here, and either type in layer or landscape or something. You'll have to search for it a little bit. But what we're looking for is the landscape layer blend. And when I click on that, I have this node which currently has nothing in it. But if we look, so with the node selected, look into the details panel, material expression landscape layer blend has an option to add array elements. So if I add 1, I now have a single layer in my material. If I add another array element, I now have 2 layers in my layer blend node, and so on and so on and so on. So for now, I'm going to add 3. I'm going to take the texture sample, copy it twice, so I have 3 different textures in my scene. And for this texture, I'm going to choose some snow, maybe a little bit of dirty snow. Why not? Reminds me of New York. Sorry, New York, but you know it's real. And for the other one, what were the materials that I brought in? I've already forgotten. A cliff. Okay, sure. We'll add a cliff. It should be a snowy cliff, but we'll just deal with it at the moment, for example's sake. Okay, so we're looking for the albedo of this cliff. Fantastic. So I could now drag my textures into my layer node, but the layer names are not particularly helpful. So let's click into my layer node and expand these layer options. The first option is layer name, which corresponds to the layer name that you will see in this node, as well as the layer name that you will see in your painting options once we get that all set up. So for now, I'm just going to match the layer name to the texture coming in. So this one is going to be grass, this one's going to be snow, and this one will be cliff. Drag snow into snow. And then lastly, I will bring the layer blend into base color. And that's really all we need to do. There are a couple of other options that I just want to give mention to in the layer blend node, such as blend type. Specifically, the default is weight blend, which means that as we paint one area with a certain layer, that layer will take up that full area. But there are other options as well with alpha and height. They're just different ways that the layers will blend together. Weight blend overwrites the other layers on that area that you're painting, but alpha preserves the other layers. So look into those if you're interested, but for a sort of very brief overview, weight blend is perfectly fine for what we need. Now that I've done that, I'm going to hit apply and go back to my landscape. And once things have processed for a little bit, we will now see that there are 3 layers under target layers where previously there were none. If you are following this process and you do not see any layers here, make sure that firstly your material, your simple landscape material is applied to the landscape material slot in your landscape details. And then if you still don't see anything there, just drag that in again. Sometimes you need to drag things in more than once to kind of give the system a bit of a kick. So here we have our layer options, and still if I click on any of these under my paint tool and start painting, nothing happens. And fortunately, there is a very helpful message. This layer has no layer info assigned yet. So basically what we need to do is assign a layer info. The layer info is essentially a way to keep track of which areas on the landscape you paint. So each layer needs one of those. And the way to do that is there is a little plus next to the layer. We can choose weight blended or non-weight blended. For our case, we are blending the weights together, so we need to choose weight blended. And now the question is, where do we save it? Because each landscape is tied to a map itself, we want to save the layer information in a folder related to that map. Here I have my map landscape material map. Unreal has already generated a folder called shared assets, and I'm just going to save this as my grass layer info. And I'll do the same with snow and with cliff. Now that I have all of my layer info set up, I should be able to click on snow, choose a brush size, and start painting. At first, you might have the little checkered pattern while Unreal compiles its shaders for the snow, and if I did that with the cliff, the same thing might happen. But just wait for it a little bit, and then and it should process fine. Okay, so now I can paint some snow onto my scene. And if I didn't like the snow, I can paint some grass as well. And if I don't like the grass, I can paint some cliff. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that very obvious tiling pattern, which we will deal with in the third material type. There we are. That is the simplest, most straightforward way to get started painting materials, painting textures onto your landscape. It seems like I've lost the images there, but no worries. We still have the option to paint paint onto my scene. this is clearly very imperfect. There are visibly repeated tilings with these snow images being repeated over and over and over. Same with the grass. And it's very flat. We do not have any of the sort of bumpiness that a normal map brings in. And as I mentioned earlier, all we did was set the, if we look at our landscape material, we've manually set the roughness across the board to 1, which might not be true. For example, snow might not appear super rough everywhere. Let's build on this by creating a new material and adding a couple of more interesting features to it. So right click material, and I'm going to call this M parameter landscape material. I'm only naming this like this to distinguish it from the simple material. If you're actually building a project, I suggest you name it something a little bit more relevant to the scene that you're creating. But in my case, I'm going to call it the parameter landscape material because I'm introducing the parameters to this material. So if I double click on that and open it up, the first thing that I want to do is just bring in what we had for our other material as a starting point. But instead of dragging roughness, instead of dragging a constant value of 1 into roughness, I want to add the roughness map. So each of these, if we search for grass again, the grass came in with a roughness map as well. So I want to do the same thing for roughness. Now, your instinct might be to just copy this whole node tree and then bring in the base color into base color and then replace all of these textures with roughness and drag the roughness blend into there. You can do that, but that's going to get real hairy real quickly. Your node tree is going to expand, especially if you start bringing in normal maps, emission maps, etc., etc. Why would your landscape be emissive? Maybe you're doing something sci-fi. The way that I'm going to get around this is by using material attributes. Material attributes are a way for us to combine a bunch of these different options for materials. So the color, the specular, the roughness, all of this type of stuff into a single node. And then we can use those nodes as inputs for this layer blend. So what does that look like? First of all, let's type material attribute. And we have a couple of material attribute options. I'm going to choose make material attributes. So if we look at this material attribute, especially side by side with the output, it's very similar. In fact, it is the same, just with a couple of these options not actually grayed out. So we can combine any collection of these inputs that we want into a single output node. The reason that that's really handy is that we can now take this texture sampler and drag it a little bit away, copy that a couple of times, and include our grass roughness and our grass normal as inputs into roughness and normal respectively. And now I can take this single output from the material attribute into layer grass, and the error that is thrown is because we can't combine two different types of things. We're trying to combine a texture and a material attribute. So if I do the same with the other inputs, I'm just going to copy material attributes, take the snow into the base color of the snow, and then let's just get rid of that. I wasn't using those textures below. Take the snow into the snow and take the cliff into another material attribute. Now we can combine all of these material attributes together. And the other thing that's really handy about this is that if you are missing a normal map, for example, this isn't going to throw any errors at you because each of these material attributes is considered its own entity, and they all work together. There's one more thing that we need to do here, which is that this output is a material attribute output, but we're sending it into the base color. And as you can see, our material does not like that. It doesn't really know what to do with that. So we either need to convert the output into a material attribute output itself, or we need to break out these material attributes again. We've combined them all together, and then now we need to break them out again and feed each slot into the output slot. So the one thing that we could do is if we deselect all of our nodes so that we're just dealing with the material details, somewhere in here there is under material there is a use material attributes. And if we click use material attributes, that collapses our output node into a single material attributes node. And then we can drag this output from our materials attributes into our material attributes output. All right, so I've gone through and added the other texture maps to each material attribute, roughness and normal, for each of these materials, or each of these layers, the grass, the snow, and the cliff. The other thing that I've done is added a metal value of 0.5. And the only reason that I've done that is if we look at the Quixel material that's come in, for example, for grass, and look at that default material, they seem to have a metal value coming in of 127 gray, which is the halfway point between 0 and 255. So equates on a scale of 0 to 1 to 0.5. And that seems to be how they've set up their materials, so I did the same. All right, now that we've done that, we should be able to hit apply, and it will probably take a while for the landscape to update, so grab a coffee. All right, so let's go back into our materials and make sure that our landscape has the parameter landscape material attached. And we can see the difference between the parameter landscape and the simple landscape by just dragging each one in. And it's a subtle difference for now, but you can see that because of that normal map and that roughness map, the darker areas fill out a little bit more than using a simple color value. Right, so, and the same for the snow as well. So that's that, and it's a good start, but we haven't actually parameterized anything yet, and this is called the parameter landscape material. So let's expose a couple of values to an instanced material. The first thing that we have to do is then actually instance this material. So I'm going to right click on this and say create material instance, and hopefully this is familiar to you if you have watched the Intro to Materials series. And now instead of using the landscape material, I'm going to use the landscape material instance in our landscape. If we double click on that, we have the materials panel, which has all of the exposed attributes, which is currently nothing. So let's go ahead and add some of those. So back in our sort of master material, if we wanted to, or if I imagined that I'm not super happy with this grass layer and I want to experiment with a couple of different grass layers, one thing that I could do is right click and add a texture object. A texture object is just a container for a texture, which we can drag into the text input of the texture sample. Then to expose this as something that we can change in the instance, we will have to right click and say convert to parameter. Once we've converted to parameter, we name it as the grass albedo, and I'm going to set, unfortunately it reverts to the default texture when I do that, so I have to set this back to the grass albedo. And I'm going to do that again for the snow, for the roughness and the normal. Okay, so I have my three parameters, or my three texture objects now set up, and they are all parameters, which means that once I save this, and Unreal does its thing, I can open my instance of that material, and I have the option to open up each of these textures and replace them with something else. So this can be helpful if, actually, I want my snow. Let's bring this window out. I want my grass, instead of grass, I want it to be snow. I'll search for some fresh snow. And I will search for the fresh snow roughness, and I will search for the fresh snow normal. Why did that not work? Oh, ha! I've got those the wrong way around. Fresh snow normal. Snow normal and the fresh snow roughness. There we go. That's more like it. And the joy there was that we did not have to wait for everything to recompile. So if you're experimenting with textures, it might save a little bit of time to set up your material to be able to with parameters for the texture objects, so that you can swap them around without having to sit and wait for everything to recompile. Saving time isn't the only reason to use parameters in material instances. We can also change for example, we can create some interesting controls, like increasing the normal strength or changing the amount of roughness and things like that. So let's add a parameter to change the normal strength. And one way to change the normal strength, normals are a bit weird. We can't just multiply the output of the normal by some value. To change the influence of the normal, we need to only multiply the red and the green channels. So what I'm going to do is create a mask. It's called a component mask. If I find, where is the component? I might just have to search component mask. A component mask takes an input of a certain amount of channels, up to 4, so red, green, blue, and then alpha, and outputs only the channels that you select. So in the default case, it's red and green, which is exactly what we need. So we're going to take the RGB output of our normal texture sample node and then multiply that by some value, which I'm going to call, first of all, create a constant, convert it to a parameter, and then call this normal strength. Cool. Now we multiply the normal strength. We multiply the red and green values of the normal by the normal strength, and now we have to add that blue value back on. The easiest way to do that is to use an append node, which is going to append, where is it? There we go. Append vector, it's called. And it's going to take this 2-channel output of our multiply node and append whatever else we add to it. So in this case, we want to append the blue channel. So this append node takes that RG, adds a B, making everything RGB. And if we take that into our normal and make sure that our normal strength, let's create a max slider value of 2, just to give us some parameters to play with. And by default, the value is 1. Hit apply. Now this is going to take a while to recompile, so grab yourself a coffee. All right, now that that's loaded, we can go up and open our material parameter. It's been a long day. And enable normal strength, and now we can start playing around with the normal values. So if we set it to 2, you can see that that has sort of accentuated the bumpiness, which is what the normal map is all about. And if we set that to closer to 0, we get much more of a smooth snow without all of the bumps. So even though we have set a slider, we can input numbers that are above that slider max. So if we say 3, then we get a really chunky snow. And yeah, that's useful. So that's just one example, and you can use this principle to change any of the other options in this material. For example, if you wanted, something that people do a lot is to add a, I'm going to hold down 3 and click to create a color input, convert that to a parameter. Name this parameter grass tint. And it's strange because we're not tiny tint. it's strange because we're not actually working with grass anymore because we've replaced the grass with snow. So this is where naming also becomes a little bit tricky. Technically, I should really just keep the first slot for grass, but I'm using snow, so we'll deal with that paradox in a little bit. Anyway, back to what we're doing here. So I'm going to create a new parameter of type color, so vector 3, and this is going to be called grass tint, and I'm going to create another parameter of type vector 1 constant, and I'm going to make this into a parameter. I'm going to call this grass tint influence. I'm going to set that at a slider max of 1, and by default it is 0. And what I'm going to do now is linearly interpolate between the output of the texture and the color. Let's add a default color of something really outrageous, like hot pink or something. So a linear interpolation, or lerp node, linear interpolate, or lerp, blends between one input, input A, and another input, input B, by input alpha. So input alpha expects a value between 0 and 1, and if that value is totally, if we set things up this way, so from texture sample to grass tint, the alpha, when the alpha is 0, the output of this lerp node will be entirely what's coming out from the texture sample, and if the alpha coming in is 1, then the output of this lerp node is going to be entirely the grass tint. And that's what I'm going to use as I'm going to use the influence as the alpha. So when influence is 0, we only use the grass. When influence is 1, we only use the tint, and we can slide between the two. This is not exactly a robust tint, not even an accurate tint, because we're just replacing the color. However, it will do to demonstrate. Maybe it would be called grass override. So now that that's loaded, let's have a look at what we could do by enabling the grass tint influence, enabling the grass tint, setting it to something like hot pink. And as we slide the influence up, we get more of a colorful snow or grass. Yeah, so, a little bit of a golden snow. No, maybe we don't want that. Anyway, I'll set that back to 0 because this was just an example. The last thing that I'll note for this type of material is that there is a limit to the number of texture samplers. This is across Unreal. It's not specific to landscapes, but there's a limit to the amount of texture samplers that you can use in a shader, and that limit is 16. It's not even a limit of Unreal, it's a limit of graphics hardware. There are a couple of ways to get around that if you absolutely 100% need more than 16 texture samplers in your scene, in your material. I think if you select all of your materials and under the material settings in details, change the sampler source to shared, that will resolve the issue. Or at least get around the 16 texture limit by combining all of the textures into one giant texture. So that comes at a cost. So that is very inefficient, and it's not super advised. So only use that if you absolutely 100% need to. There are other ways to get around this texture maximum. One way is texture packing. So for example, roughness we only use one value from. We're not using all 3 channels. So you could combine roughness with you could combine 3 roughness textures together, or you could combine roughness and, if you're using ambient occlusion, you could combine those different textures together into, and each of those textures would be a single channel in one bigger texture. So there are ways to get around it, but the simplest way to get around it is to not use more than 16 texture samplers in your material. Now that we're done with that, let's move on to the third type of material, or the third method that I want to go through today, which is using material functions. And it helps keep things a little bit more organized. So I'm going to start from a fresh material by creating a new material and calling this m underscore function. I'm going to call this function landscape material. Now, the same disclaimer as I did before, this is not a super useful name because it doesn't describe anything about the material itself. It's just describing the technique that we're using. So we're creating material functions inside of this. So I don't encourage you to use this naming convention other than to distinguish between the other two types that we're using today. Anyway, here we are with the empty function. And just for convenience sake, I'm going to take the layer blend node from my other function, the one that we created earlier, and pop that into this function. So we're going to be using the same general principle of combining a couple of different things pertinent to one layer into a material attribute, and then feeding that into the layer blend, and then feeding that layer blend into something else down the line. But we'll do it in a slightly more sort of segmented way. This node graph that we created earlier can get a little bit unwieldy. This type of thing can get a little bit unwieldy, and if we want to change one thing, we have to go and figure out where it is in the node tree. And if we had a couple of more material attributes and a couple more parameters in here, things might get a little bit confusing pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do in my new function, in my new material, is use material functions to separate these out into their own specific functions. Material functions are basically snippets of a material node tree or node graph that have been broken out into their own thing that you can then reuse in multiple different materials. There are a lot of material functions already built into Unreal, which we can search for on the palette in the right-hand side of the material window by changing the category from all to functions. And then all of these are functions that somebody else in Unreal, probably at Epic, has written for you. So if we just take, for example, rotate vector, functions are distinguished by being blue, a little blue banner. We can double click into this and see that this function has the same sort of structure of a material tree, but it has this special output result. So our rotate vector takes in two inputs, which we see in this tree, and then has one output, does some stuff to it along the way, but it's condensed all of that, all of this spaghetti into a single node that we can use in this material, in another material. We can use twice in this material if we wanted to. Material functions are an incredibly powerful tool. So we're going to use material functions by creating our own, which will hold all of the information that we want for a specific layer. And the output of our material function will come straight into one of these layers here. There are a few ways to create a material function. One is to right-click, type material function, which will give us an option, material function call. So the process of running a function is called calling it. And then in the left-hand side of the screen, in the details panel, we now have the option to choose any of the functions that already exist, or in the top of this window, create our own. So I'm going to create a material function, and it asks me where I want to save this. This is a very good question. I'm going to save it in my materials folder, in a new folder called material functions. And it asks me what I want to call this. Naming is super important, as we all know. So for now, I'm going to call this MF, which stands for material function, underscore grass layer. I don't like that name. We may revisit this. But this has now given us a function call to a material function called grass layer. If I double click on that, there's nothing in it except this output result, and there's an error saying you're missing whatever you want to output. So we need to have something that's going to output here. We could just output, for example, a straight up color, and then maybe say that this is green. And now every time we call this material function, we've just created a green maker. So whenever we call this material function, the output result will be green. We could put that into our base color, and now our material will be green. Fantastic. However, we don't necessarily, we want to be a bit more robust than that. So I'm going to click back in. What I want the output of this function to be is a material attribute. So I'm going to call material attribute, make material attributes, and we'll have the same node that we saw earlier. And we can take the output of this material attribute into the output of our function. So now if we wanted the same green thing, we could bring the green into base layer, but actually forget that. I'm not going to do that. I think you get the picture at this point, right? Cool. Let's close the rotate vector. It's just getting in the way. Now our grass layer is a, the output of this grass layer is a material attribute. So we can do the same thing that we did if we look at our earlier code, where we took 3 material attributes and put them each into a layer blend. We can do the same with our grass layer. So we can take the grass layer into grass layer, and then the output of this into, we had to, in the material details panel, we had to somewhere here say use material attributes. So we can take this input into material attributes. Excellent. We haven't actually done anything yet because this is still an empty blank material attribute. So just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to take what we did earlier with the texture sampler, and in our grass layer, I'll double click back into the grass layer, paste this in here, and make these connections. Because this is grass and not snow, I'm going to go ahead and change these out to be the grass textures. Okay, now we have a material function which replaces all of this from our previous material, this big chunk of code into one single node. Chunk of nodes, into one single node. But we only have one of them, so we need to create a couple more. We could go through the same process of right-clicking material function call. Nope, I can't do that. Material function call, and then creating a new one, etc., etc. Or if I go back to my main content window, under material functions, there is now this grass layer material function. So I can duplicate that and create a new material function based off of the old one called snow material, snow layer, for example. And then all I have to do is go in there and replace these textures again. Snow. Let's make fresh snow this time. And and snow. Normal. Apply that. Great, so now I have a second material function called material function snow that defines what the snow layer is going to be. I need to get that somehow into my landscape material. One way is to click on the, in the content window, click on the material function and just drag it in, and it will drag in as a new window, as a new node. The other thing that we could do is add the material function as one of the material functions that we have access to in our big library of functions. The problem is that if we try to search for it right now, it's not going to come up. Because to expose this function to the sort of global function library, there's one checkbox that we need to check in the actual function itself. With none of the nodes selected, go to the details panel and click expose to library. And if you hover over that, it says whether to list this function in the materials function library. Once we've done that and we hit apply, then in our landscape material, which now lives in our landscape material, which I'm going to pop back into our main window, I can delete that, right click and type mf snow layer, and we've got our snow layer, which we can drag into the snow layer. This is also something that's applicable across materials, not specific to landscape materials. Material functions are a super powerful way to organize your node trees, so I suggest that you use them. All right, next up, we'll duplicate that one more time by clicking duplicate. One thing that I will note here is that you do see an option to create a function instance. I haven't had success in getting the function instances to work specifically with landscapes. It would be really cool if we were able to create one sort of master function and then create instances of that for different layers, but I haven't been able to get that to work. If you find a way to get that to work, please let me know, because that would save a lot of the time that we're about to put into the next steps here. But yeah, unfortunately, I just haven't been able to get that to work. But I'm going to create one last layer of dirty snow, perhaps. So I'll duplicate this one more time. Call this the dirty snow layer. Or wait, I'll follow the same thing that we were doing before. The cliff layer. Open that up, replace some of these textures. Expose this. Oh, it is already, because I copied it from the other layer. Call my cliff layer into my landscape material. And then we've got here all of the material attributes coming into our layer blend. This is exactly the same in concept as what's happening in our earlier material, except all we've done is broken things out into functions. So that's kind of a preference option, whether you want the organization of having each of your functions in its own separate entity, and if you want to change one, you just go into the one function rather than having a giant node spaghetti to deal with. So yeah, those are your two options. There's two more things that I want to cover, which one is getting information into these material functions, and then the other is a different way of dealing with the material attributes as the output. So let's first start with getting things into the material layer. The question that I have is, I've got this landscape material, and it's looking okay. However, the scale is a little off. Maybe. I mean, it's not, but if I wanted to scale the texture that's coming in a little bit, like increase the size or decrease the size, the way that I would do that is to... Where's my landscape material? The way that I would do that in general is to take the texture coordinates coming in and then multiply them by some scalar before sending them into the texture sampler. So looking at the old material, we've got a texture sample here with a space for a UV, which we've been kind of ignoring for now, but I would multiply the UVs coming in by some value. The problem is that with these material functions, we lose access to those UVs. So what I want to do is go into, for example, the grass layer and be able to expose these UVs that are coming in back in my landscape material to be able to control from the landscape material the size of the textures in each of these functions. So the way that I'm going to do that is open up the function and right-click, type input. And we've got a function input here. And the default function input is a vector 3, but really what I want it to be is a vector 2, because a UV coordinate stands for U and V, or the other way around, one of those. So now that I have a vector coming in, I can take the input vector into texture sample, and texture sample. Just had a moment. And when I save this back in our material function, we can pass in a vector2 value. For example, a texture coordinate, or since we're dealing with landscapes, a landscape coordinate. A landscape coordinate. There we go. And I'll have to do the same for the, let's just copy and paste actually. I'll have to do the same for each of the other material functions. So it's a little bit of extra work because we have to click into each new function rather than having them all there in front of you. But like I said, it's exactly the same thing as having one giant node tree, except you're just breaking out sections of it into their own entities. So depending on whether you can stand the massive visual chaos of all of these nodes, you may or may not have to use material functions. So I've got my 3 material functions now, each with, why is this not working? Save. Cool. Each with the vector3 input. So I can add my landscape coordinates in, and then I can do what I wanted to do originally, which is scale these up or down. So add a multiply node, and then add a constant into that multiply. Let's have it as a default of 1. Convert that to a parameter so that it's now exposed to our instance materials. Call this texture scale. And bring in the landscape coordinates to that. And feed the output of that into each of these. And of course, if you want to split these up so that the snow layer is scaled differently, you can do that. You would just need different parameters for each. Okay, let's hit apply. And oh, we haven't actually taken my function landscape material into my landscape material slot yet, so let's add it in. Instead, actually, you know what? Instead of doing that, I'm going to create a material instance and bring the instance into the slot, because our instance will have that texture scale parameter exposed. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. All right, excellent. So in our, let's go back to the landscape editor, and we have our grass, snow, and cliff layers, which are each taking a second to update, and that's totally fine. And now with our scale parameter in our function material instance, we can increase the scale, or rather increase the multiplier, which means that the UV maps are repeated more times, or there's more of them fitted into a specific area, which means that the texture appears smaller. Or we can multiply it by less than 1, so 0.5, to make the texture appear larger, because you are fitting less of it into a specific place. All right. Yeah, and it's applied to the snow as well. Excellent. There are 2 more small little notes that I want to add to the material functions. One is that there is a preview option for this input, which is super helpful, because if we look at this material preview right now, the general color is there, but we've lost all of the detail of these textures, and that's because by default this input is 0, 0, 0. So the way that UV maps work is by changing the coordinate between 0 to 1 across a certain area of the mesh. So if your UV coordinate coming in is just 0 the whole time, you're getting exactly the same sample point for all of the different positions on the mesh. So if we added a texture coordinate to the preview input, then once this is actually used, for example, in our function, in our landscape material, it's going to override that preview, but for our preview node, it does allow us to see the material as it would be. So that's one thing that's like a slight little quality of life help. And the other thing that we can do is we don't actually lose access to parameterization. It just becomes slightly more of a burden. I can, for example, create a texture object, call and convert this to, nope. I always hit convert to texture sample instead of convert to parameter. And name this grass albedo. And I'll get to why I had to add grass, because it's a little bit redundant in the naming. But I've got grass albedo, and I can take that into the texture. And I'll just, by default, turn that into grass. I'm only going to use the base color as the demonstration, because adding all of the other textures might become a little bit tedious. But just to demonstrate, I've added this texture object, save the material, and there's no change in our material function yet, or ever. But if we go back to our landscape material and open up the instance of our landscape material, we now do have a slot here to override the grass albedo. The same thing applies if we add any parameters to snow. So I'll do the same thing here and add a texture object. For now, we'll make it the fresh snow. Drag it into there. I have to convert to parameter. It's going to reset to default. I'm going to call this the snow albedo. Turn that into... Come on, don't be shy. I've lost the ability to click. I think my computer's very tired. It's okay. Ooh, yeah. When the little tutorial icon freezes, you know you're in trouble. Okay, we're back. So this is called snow albedo, and I'm going to bring it in from fresh snow. Hit apply. Wait for years and years and years. Hit save. Obviously, because we are changing things within the actual master function, Unreal is going to have a little bit of a moment where it has to recompile all of those. But in our instance, we now have the snow albedo as well. So any parameters that anything that we convert to a parameter within each material function will get sent up the chain into our instance, sent down the chain into our instance, and allow us to change those as parameters here. So we don't actually lose the ability to what we did in our, where was it? In our parameter function. Where was it? You know what I'm talking about. Yeah, this one. Everything that we can do in our parameter function, we can do in our material functions as well. The reason that it gets a little bit tricky, and the reason that I named this grass albedo and then this one snow albedo, is because if they were both called albedo, one would overwrite the other, or rather, the downstream function, when it all compiles together in an instance, will recognize only one albedo and update them both. So if you were to overwrite that in the instance, over here, you would only see a single albedo, and that would replace both the grass and the snow albedo. So you need to be a little bit careful about your naming and name each one as a unique name. The same applies for other values as well. So if you had in your grass layer a roughness function, or a the normal scale or something, the normal scale, you would have to call it grass normal scale if you wanted it to be unique. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So that was the last two things that I wanted to talk about on the material functions. It was the preview texture and the parameterization. So the last thing that I wanted to cover in this video overall was breaking out your material attributes. So the way that I've been using these material attributes so far has been directly piping the layer blend into the output material attribute. And we enabled that, just as a refresher, by clicking on the details panel of our material and enabling use material attributes, which is not enabled by default. So if we uncheck that again and go back to the default, there is another way that we can use material attributes, and that is by taking the output, which is a material attribute, and breaking that material attribute out by saying break material attributes into its component parts. So in each of these material functions, we made a material attribute, which we send to the layer blend, blends them all together, spits out one single material attribute node, or one single material attribute, which we can then break out further into each of its individual components. So because I know that all I'm using is the base color, the roughness, I added some metallic in there, and the normal, those are the only options that I'm going to bring over. But if I had an emission map or something, or if there was some there wouldn't be transparency in a landscape. But yeah, in any of these other options, we could also enable if we knew that somewhere up the chain, one of these material functions was using it. Now, why would you do things this way? Well, one thing that we can do is add a global change to the base color, which we would not be able to do if we were feeding directly feeding the output of the material attribute into a output node. So if we wanted to inject something in here, in this base color output, that would apply to all the different colors of the scene, this is where we would do it. Same with the normal. So if you knew that your landscape wanted to have a little bit more of a bumpiness throughout the scene, we could add something to the normal over here. And one instance where this comes in useful is what I alluded to at the very beginning, and we finally got here. But if we look at this texture, especially further out, it becomes very, very apparent that this texture is a single repeating image over and over and over again. The grass isn't, you can see it at certain angles, and at certain angles it's not as apparent. But there are some materials which are a lot more obvious. For instance, the cliff. Wait, why is that not drawing? Oh, I have to be in paint. For instance, the cliff. If we look at the cliff, that is very, very obviously one image repeating over and over. Now, the technique that we're about to use is not a miracle worker. We probably won't be able to get rid of this entire visual artifact of repeated images. So that is just something to be aware of, is that if you choose an image for your landscape texture, or for any texture that has like a specific feature. So if you look at this, it's got a very distinct non-uniform pattern to it. When that feature is repeated over and over and over, you will see some tiling. The grass is less so, because the grass is a little bit more sort of uniform looking, so there's less specific individual features to see repeated. So this detiling that we're about to go through, your mileage may vary. But without further ado, let's get to it. One of the simplest ways of detiling is to add a little bit of color variation across a larger area to sort of break up the visual repetition. This is such a common thing that there is built into the engine a texture called macro variation. So to do this, we're going to need a texture sample. We're going to be sampling from some sort of noisy texture. You can definitely bring in your own. The sort of more unique your own texture is, the better the output will be. But there is if we search for macro variation, one of these is built in, and one of them comes with the third-person starter content. I can't really remember which one is which. I think they're both the same. Starter content textures, there we go. So if you have the starter content, you will have access to this texture sample, this macro variation. The general principle of what we're doing is, for the darker areas of the output of this texture, we will be decreasing the brightness of our base color. And for the lighter areas of the texture, we will be increasing the brightness of the base color. There's a few ways that we can add this sort of brightness adjustment. What I'm going to be doing is a multiply. And multiply will mean that the brighter areas change, but the darker areas kind of remain the same. You could also do an add, which would change the whole, sort of bring up the darker areas as well. But this is something that we can experiment with, and multiply will just be one of the simpler ways of applying this. So for multiply, when we multiply this base value by a value of 1, the image will remain the same, or the output will remain the same. But if we multiply by 1.1, it'll be a slightly brighter image. And if we multiply by 0.9, it'll be a slightly darker output. So let's add our multiply node in and build this backwards. Multiply. And take the output of that into our base color. So now we've got our multiply, but I don't want to drag the straight output of the texture sample into the multiply, because currently the values that are coming out of this texture sample are between 0 and 1. If we take this output with no adjustment, we're essentially just going to be darkening our scene no matter what. So I want to adjust these values so that they're not between 0 and 1, but sort of hovering around 1 as the midpoint, and then between 0 and maybe 2, or 0.5 and 1.5, or some sort of range with 1 in the middle of that range. The easiest way to do that is to multiply the values coming out of this by 2. So that's going to convert the 0 to 1 that's coming out of RGB to 0 to 2, which means that 1 is in the middle. And then we can use our trusty linear interpolate function. Where is this? Linear interpolate. To scale these values down closer to a range around 1. So the reason that I'm doing this is that this multiply takes the range from 0 to 2, but that's probably too big of a range. I want to condense that range down to something like 0.9 to 1.1 or something like that. And by using lerp, if our second value here is 1, the higher this alpha is to 1, the closer this output will be to 1, based on this input range. Let's see what that looks like in practice, because at the moment this is all just words and numbers. I'm going to need a constant 1 called macro. No, I need to create a parameter, convert a parameter, and call this parameter macro. Gosh damn it. Ooh, commenting. That's something I haven't really spoken about much. Macro influence. So I'm going to call this macro variation influence, and I'll make this a scale between 0 and 1 and a default of 0. So at first there'll be no influence, and I think in fact I'm going to take this multiply and instead of making it A, put it into B and make A 1, so that when the influence, this is just a naming thing because I've named this influence, so when influence is 0, then the lerp output is going to be 1, because when alpha is 0, the lerp output is A. But then when the influence is 1, the lerp output is going to be some value between 0 and 2, so that's going to be the maximum of our range. So that's why I switched those two things around, so that the influence corresponds to 0 being no influence, 1 being full influence. And take that into the multiply, and now I've set up everything that I want. There is actually one last thing that I want to set up here, which is, at the moment, the UVs of this texture will be the default UVs, so the landscape UVs, which we can change the texture scale that isn't this macro. But if our texture scale is 1, that means that our macro variation texture coming in is also going to be 1. It means that our macro variation texture is going to be sampled at the same coordinates as the textures that we are trying to remove the repetition from, which means ultimately that will mean that our macro variation is actually increasing the repetition rather than decreasing the repetition. So I want to add one more thing to adjust the scale of this macro variation as well. And for that, I will do the same process as I did before by adding a texture coordinate, slightly different to the landscape coordinate. In fact, I'll use the landscape coordinate. Never mind, I'll use the landscape coordinate. For now, they sort of do the same thing. There are some more advanced things that we can do later, but I'll use the landscape coordinate and multiply this by some sort of constant 1. So for that, I just held 1 and clicked, left-clicked on the screen. And I'm going to convert that to a parameter called macro variation scale. And add a multiply node in here, multiply the coordinates coming in by the scale, and take that into the UVs. And now we have an option. We can probably add a slider if we... Nah, I won't add a slider. So the default will be 1, which is not good for us. So we will need to go in and adjust that and what it looks like. So just to go over all of that again, we are bringing in some sort of texture that will be used to break up the repetition, the repeated patterns of our scene. We are multiplying that texture by 2 so that we have a range where 1 is the center of that range, so from 0 to 2. Then we are using linear interpolate to either shrink or expand that range based on some sort of influence factor. So when the influence is 0, our range is exactly 1 and doesn't change. So it doesn't change the output color at all. Or when our influence is 1, then our range is bigger. It's from 0 to 2. Which means that we will see a lot of influence on this base color. And then we are multiplying that range by the base color, outputting the base color with certain offsets in different areas. And finally, we are scaling that input texture based on some input parameter scale. Okay, let's see what that all looks like when we apply and wait for everything to compile. All right, so here we are in our landscape. Let's see what landscape. So we've got the function landscape instance right there. And at the moment, we don't have any macro influence and our scale is 1. So first of all, if we increase the macro variation influence to 1, what happens? Well, you can see that the repeated pattern immediately becomes more recognizable. And that's what I was talking about, where we need this scale slider as well to be able to say, to change the scale of our macro variation so it doesn't fit exactly with the textures that are already repeating. So if we move that down a little bit, you can see things start to expand a little bit, but we really need to get it down to about 0.1 before we start seeing that it actually breaks up the pattern in the ground without being visually repeated itself. If we go far enough above the ground, you'll see that this macro variation is the thing that now repeats. So if you have a scene or a game or an environment where you need to see the world from really high up as well as really low, close to the ground, you might want to where are we? You might want to layer a couple of these on top of each other and have one that's the really big scale, so like a really low number, which applies to the really large bird's eye view, one that's a medium scale, and then one on the smaller scale, which is what we're currently using for when you're closer down to the ground. Because now that we're here, you can see that this has absolutely broken up the visual sort of repetition of the grass. The grass doesn't seem to repeat at all, except for when you get further out into the distance, which hopefully you will be breaking up with other things, mountains and stuff along the way. Like I said earlier, it doesn't really solve the problem of the super visible repetition. So in our cliff material, for example. So that's something that you would have to be either add more layers of variation or just use a different texture entirely, or only use this texture for really small amounts of ground at a time. The other thing, though, is that we do have an influence slider, and right now this grass doesn't really look supernatural because it just looks like there's patches of maybe dead or really sick grass. So we can use that influence slider to say, you know what, I don't want full influence, I want something like, maybe half influence, even though that's a meaningless concept. And now the grass doesn't look as sickly. Maybe if we take the macro variation down to 0.05, we can start being slightly more subtle about the effect, but still having enough visual difference that it breaks up the repeated pattern. One last thing I should mention is that because we injected this code, the reason that we broke the material and then added the variation to the output color is because now this variation applies to the whole material, all of the colors. So rather than having to do this whole process for the grass layer, the snow layer, and the cliff layer, we can do it all at once at the end for the final output of the material, which means that I've only shown you what it looks like at at grass, but the same thing applies to the snow. So we have this slightly beaten up snow look, which we might want to go in and adjust the levels a little bit. By adding the variation at the end, by breaking out the material attributes, we add this variation to the whole material. So that sort of covers it. It's not perfect, and as I said, if we get high enough off the ground, you will see a little bit of the repeated pattern, and you still might see a little bit of the grass repetition in the background. There are other things that we can do to mitigate that. One of the things that you can do in materials in Unreal is change the material based on distance from the camera. So we could have a material that is pure green far away from the camera, but then gets more into this bumpy grass closer to the camera. This has been a long video, so I don't think I'll do that right now. If there's enough interest, I could definitely go over that in another video. But for now, I think I'll call it here. Just to go over what we've done today. We started with a very straightforward three textured material where the output of the layer blend goes straight into the color, which means that the only thing that you are painting is the sort of base color of the material. And then we built on that to add the other types of textures that you might want, such as roughness and normal. We started looking into how Quixel created their own materials and learned that we need to add a metallic of 0.5 if we want to really replicate what the Quixel material does. I went over parameters, exposing different either textures or numbers to your material instance editor to allow you to creatively tweak your materials without having to wait for the entire material to recompile. And then lastly, we went through some material functions, which are ways of taking chunks of a node graph and breaking them out into its own separate entity, which for the most part helps with organization. Because if we look at this material function, it's a lot more robust than something like this, which does very much the same, but in a lot more of a visually chaotic way. So material functions can help you organize your node code a little bit more, at the cost of having to go into a separate function if you wanted to adjust something. All right, that's it from me. I hope this has helped start you on your journey to creating some interesting landscapes, and goodbye and take care.